What happens when the truth can no longer be ignored? For decades, 5 cold cases haunted communities, each one a puzzle left unsolved. But in 2025, groundbreaking technology, tireless detectives, and an unwavering pursuit of justice shattered the silence. These are the stories of victims who were never forgotten and the heroes who made sure their voices were heard. The Baby Jane Doe case, Longview, Texas. In 1998, a newborn's life was taken, hidden beneath the silence of a forgotten night in Longview, Texas. Wrapped in a small, crumpled blanket, left discarded on the edge of a road, the baby's body would remain a mystery for years. She would be known only as Baby Jane Doe, an identity that would elude everyone, even the people who should have been there to protect her. A tiny life, stolen before it had a chance to grow, tossed away as though it meant nothing. The weight of this loss is difficult to imagine. It wasn't just the death of a child. It was the absence of answers, the uncertainty of who could be so callous. It haunted the community, and for 27 years it would fester in the minds of those who could never forget the girl who never had a name. The years went by, and time did what it does best. It hardened the case, buried it beneath layers of dust. But there is one thing that time can never do. It cannot erase the truth. And eventually, the truth would rise. In 2025, the breakthrough that no one thought would come finally did. Authorities, armed with advanced genetic genealogy techniques, found the answer where everyone else had failed. It wasn't just a name they uncovered. It was a mother, the woman responsible for the death of Baby Jane Doe. The results of years of painstaking forensic work and genetic profiling revealed her identity. Misty Marie Mitchell, now 47 years old. It was hard to fathom. A mother, a woman who had lived in the shadows, now suddenly thrust into the light for her actions. How had this happened? What could compel a mother to abandon her own flesh and blood in such a cruel way? The answer, at least the beginnings of it, began to emerge through forensic breakthroughs that were still in their infancy when the crime occurred. For nearly 3 decades, a community waited. The tragedy of Baby Jane Doe was passed down as folklore, a cautionary tale for the new generations of Longview. But despite the passage of time, the case was never forgotten. And as it turned out, neither was the identity of the one responsible. The first steps in solving the case came not with the arrest, but with the birth of a new science, genetic genealogy. This powerful tool, which had begun to unravel other cold cases across the nation, turned its focus to Baby Jane Doe. For years, the search had been limited to blood tests, DNA samples, and unidentifiable prints left on the plastic bag where the baby was found. But with the advent of new technology, a breakthrough happened. When authorities finally pinpointed Mitchell, it wasn't just a matter of matching DNA. It was a matter of piecing together years of family history, connecting distant relatives, and reconstructing the life of a woman who had long since disappeared from the world of crime. By finding Mitchell's genetic relatives, detectives were able to close in on her and ultimately identify her as the mother of Baby Jane Doe. The revelation was explosive. Misty Mitchell, now a mother of grown children, was arrested on charges of capital murder in 2025. The irony was staggering. For all those years, she had lived her life, hiding in plain sight, her secret a shadow that loomed over her and her family. Bear Brook Murders, 1980s New Hampshire. In 1978, 4 lives were buried, but the truth was buried deeper. The dense woods of Bear Brook State Park in New Hampshire hold more than just trees and wildlife. For years, they concealed a horrific secret. Hidden from view, left forgotten by time, the remains of a family cruelly abandoned lay waiting. They were discovered only by the grace of chance, and still, their true story would remain untold for decades. On that fateful day in 1985, the grim discovery would shake the world. 2 barrels, each containing the skeletal remains of women and children, were found by a hunter. At first, it was believed to be a case of a family lost to some tragic accident, a gruesome relic of the past. But what investigators found only raised more questions than answers. The victims had been brutally discarded, their identities unknown, and their families lost to time. And for over 30 years, they remained just another set of bones, another unclaimed tragedy. But sometimes, the bones hold more than memories. They hold the key to unlocking the truth. For decades, the killer, Terry Rasmussen, was nothing more than a shadow. His crimes, spread over years, left few clues behind. At the time of the murders, Rasmussen had used numerous aliases. He was a man of shifting identities, slipping through the cracks of justice, evading capture, leaving behind an unsettling trail of destruction. In the early 2000s, DNA technology began to make its mark in forensic science. With each passing year, the door to the unknown started to creak open. In 2000, investigators had the opportunity to test the remains found in Bear Brook. They now knew the bodies were not just abandoned. This was the result of something far more sinister. But the identities of the victims were still elusive. How could they solve this cold case, where the killer was long gone and the victims were nameless? This question lingered for years until the breakthrough came in 2019, thanks to the tireless work of the DNA Doe Project. This organization, using genetic genealogy, began to re-examine cold cases with a method that was unheard of just a decade ago, comparing DNA samples to distant relatives, mapping out the family tree, and uncovering identities hidden for decades. The question was no longer about solving a case. It was about bringing these lost souls back to life, giving them the names they had been denied for so long. By 2025, after years of painstaking research, the final victim, the middle child, a girl named Rhea Rasmussen, was identified. She had been only 2 or 3 years old at the time of her death. It was a moment of triumph, but also one of sorrow. For every victory in identifying these victims, there was a new layer of heartbreak added. Rhea's family would never see her again, and the answers they had been desperate for had come too late to offer solace. Her mother, Pepper Reed, who had disappeared alongside Rasmussen in the 1970s, still remained missing. The unearthing of Rhea's name was a turning point. It was not just the final piece of the puzzle, it was a revelation about the power of modern forensic methods. Familial DNA databases had changed the way investigators could trace back the roots of suspects. What had once been an impossible challenge had been transformed into a solvable mystery. Terry Rasmussen, the so-called chameleon killer, who had been caught and convicted for other crimes, was now definitively linked to the Bear Brook murders. His true identity had been unraveled, his legacy of destruction brought to light. Rasmussen's manipulative nature and his ability to slip in and out of identities had allowed him to evade justice for decades. It was this very fluidity of his identity that had shielded him from capture, making the case one of the most difficult in the history of cold case investigations. But through persistence and innovative forensic science, justice was slowly closing in on him, even though he had passed away in 2010, never facing trial for his role in these deaths. But the journey didn't end there. While Rasmussen's role in the murders had been confirmed, investigators were still searching for the missing piece of the puzzle, the identity of Pepper Reed, the woman who had been linked to the case but whose whereabouts remained a mystery. Was she another victim, or was she involved in her children's tragic fate? That question lingered in the background as authorities continued to investigate, and new leads were still being pursued. But for the families of Rhea and the others, the identification meant a closure that was decades overdue. This case, which had remained a shadowy enigma for so long, had now been cracked open by one of the most revolutionary advancements in criminal investigation. Familial DNA testing had not only brought justice, but also offered a pathway to solving the unknown mysteries that had previously seemed beyond reach. Jacksonville Jewelry Store Robbery, 2015. A robbery gone wrong. But was it ever just about money? In 2015, the quiet streets of Jacksonville, Florida, were rocked by a violent crime that no one would expect to remain unsolved for long. But for nearly a decade, the violent death of a would-be robber and the escape of his accomplice would linger, unresolved. an open wound in the heart of the city. On that fateful night in November 2015, Rodarius Magali and his accomplice stormed into a jewelry store on Edgewood Avenue. The intent was clear: to rob the store and flee without consequence. But in a split second, things spiraled out of control. The store owner, armed and ready to defend himself, fired a shot, striking one of the suspects, Kurt Dean, who died in the ensuing chaos. Magali, however, managed to flee the scene, disappearing into the night, leaving behind a bloody crime scene and a growing mystery. While the initial chaos was apparent, the investigation quickly hit a dead end. No one knew who Magali was or where he had gone. Witnesses had been shaken, and security footage was grainy at best, offering little to no help. The case quickly became just another file in a drawer marked cold. It seemed like the criminal had disappeared without a trace, at least for the time being. But the story didn't end there. A decade later, a fresh wave of determination swept through the cold case unit in Jacksonville. They weren't ready to let this crime slip through the cracks. As technology advanced, so did their methods. Witnesses were re-interviewed, new forensic tools were brought into play, and suddenly, a long-forgotten detail came to light: a name. Through re-examining old leads and applying modern DNA techniques, detectives found a break that would change everything. The name Rodarius Magali surfaced, and everything clicked. Magali had been caught up in a separate, unrelated case, already incarcerated for another crime. The connection to the jewelry store robbery was made, and the case that had remained cold for so long began to thaw. What had once seemed like a botched robbery was now revealed to be something more. Magali had evaded justice for years, not because he was clever, but because the systems that should have caught him had failed to see the full picture. The escape was not the result of brilliance, but of luck. He had vanished without a trace because law enforcement had not had the tools or the time to dig deeper. Forensic re-examinations of the crime scene, combined with growing witness testimonies, played a crucial role in piecing together what had happened that night. The cold case detectives re-examined every detail, no matter how small, and in doing so, they uncovered the crucial link between Magali and the crime. Modern DNA technology helped fill in the blanks, confirming his identity and his role in the robbery. In the midst of this investigation, the question arose: how did a man, already incarcerated for another crime, remain a free agent in such a violent and high-stakes robbery? The answer lay in the combination of new technology, witness testimony, and the persistence of detectives who refused to let the case go. Magali was now facing felony murder charges, even though the robbery had occurred years earlier. It wasn't just about solving a crime, it was about righting a wrong. The loss of life was tragic, but justice was now within reach. It was a reminder that no crime, no matter how much time passes, is truly beyond the reach of justice. Magali's arrest was a shocking twist. A man already serving time for unrelated crimes was now being charged for a robbery that had taken place years ago. His long-awaited day in court was drawing closer, and the narrative that had once been filled with uncertainty and shadows was now shining in full light. The significance of this case extends beyond the conviction itself. It demonstrates how the constant evolution of forensic science, alongside the tenacity of cold case detectives, can rewrite the outcomes of long-forgotten tragedies. No one could have predicted the path this case would take, but the cold case detectives refused to let the memory of the crime die, just as they refused to accept that Magali would escape accountability. Edna Timmy Schubert, 2003. When the walls fall silent, sometimes the answer is not lost. It just waits. In the quiet neighborhood of North Bay Shore, New York, an 88-year-old widow's life came to an abrupt and violent end. It was 2003, and Edna Timmy Schubert had lived a life of peace and solitude. Yet, on that cold winter's night, the serenity of her home was shattered. She was found in her living room, lifeless and covered in bruises, the victim of a brutal assault. It was a crime that would leave her community stunned and her family in a state of disbelief. How could anyone, let alone a neighbor, commit such an act of violence against an elderly woman? At first, the case seemed like it would be one of those unsolvable mysteries. No apparent motive, no obvious suspect. Edna had few enemies, and her friends described her as a kind and caring woman. For years, the case stalled, and while the police investigation continued, the answers remained elusive. It felt as if the world had simply forgotten Edna. But sometimes, it only takes the right set of eyes to see what others have missed. And so, in 2025, after years of waiting, the breakthrough came. This was not the work of a random intruder, but rather the calculated violence of someone who had known Edna. And as the cold case detectives returned to the scene and re-examined every shred of evidence, they would find that the key to unlocking the mystery had been there all along. The case had grown cold, but the evidence never disappeared. Forensic technology had advanced significantly since 2003, and the evidence that had once been overlooked was now ripe for reanalysis. What had seemed like an open and shut case of an elderly woman being robbed turned out to be far more complex. With new advancements in fingerprint analysis and DNA testing, the case was about to take an unexpected turn. One of the most significant pieces of evidence came from fingerprint analysis, which had never been fully explored. A print found at the scene, almost dismissed as inconclusive, would now be the key to unraveling the mystery. This fingerprint was eventually linked to Raul Ayala, a former neighbor of Edna, who had lived just a few houses down. Ayala had always been in the background of the investigation, but his connection to the murder had remained hidden until now. Through advanced DNA testing and a re-examination of his background, detectives uncovered the chilling truth. Ayala was not just a neighbor. He was the killer. His fingerprints matched the ones found at the scene, and DNA evidence from the crime scene further cemented his involvement. But the real shock came when it was revealed that Ayala had been living under the radar for years, blending into the community without suspicion. Deborah Atrop's disappearance and murder, 1988. Some disappearances stay with you forever, like shadows of the past that linger. In the early hours of October 24, 1988, a young woman named Deborah Atrops vanished without a trace from the small town of Oregon City, Oregon. A mother of one, she was last seen leaving work, her future uncertain, but her life filled with promise. The night she disappeared, she simply didn't come home. Her family and friends were left with only questions. Where had she gone? Why had she disappeared? For years, the case hovered in the air, unexplained and unresolved. Was it an accident? A random act of violence? Or was there someone close to her who had a hand in her disappearance? As time wore on, the answers never came. Her family mourned not just her loss, but the uncertainty of what had happened to her. Was she alive somewhere, or had something far more unthinkable taken place? The prime suspect had always been Robert Atrops, her estranged husband. Their marriage had been troubled for years, marked by tension and infidelity. But Robert's behavior in the aftermath of her disappearance was, at best, suspicious. Still, there wasn't enough evidence to make an arrest. There was no body, no clear signs of foul play. Just a man whose wife was missing, and his apparent lack of concern raised alarms. For nearly 37 years, the case would remain unsolved, buried under layers of time and circumstance. The investigation seemed to stall, as so many cold cases do. But as the years passed, a shift began to happen in the world of forensic science. New technology, particularly DNA testing, began to unlock answers that had once seemed impossible to find. In 2025, after decades of frustration, a breakthrough arrived. Forensic experts using advanced techniques re-examined evidence from the case that had long been overlooked. New DNA samples were found on items from Deborah's car, significant enough to reignite the investigation. When detectives returned to the case, they weren't just following old leads. They were armed with the latest advancements in forensic technology. The key to unlocking Deborah's fate lay in the very evidence that had been sitting in storage for years. Through a painstaking process of re-interviewing witnesses and piecing together the threads of Deborah's life before her disappearance, investigators slowly began to uncover the truth. It became clear that Deborah's disappearance was not an accident. She had been murdered, and Robert Atrops, her estranged husband, was responsible. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when investigators matched DNA evidence from Deborah's car to Robert Atrop's. It wasn't just circumstantial evidence anymore. It was hard, irrefutable proof. Robert had long been the prime suspect, but now, with modern DNA advancements, the case was finally solved. The breakthrough came in 2025, but it wasn't the final chapter of the story. It was the beginning of justice for Deborah Atrop's. Robert Atrop's was arrested and charged with second-degree murder, the weight of his actions now visible for all to see. For years, he had evaded the consequences of his crime, but the persistence of cold case detectives and the evolution of forensic technology had finally caught up with him. For Deborah's family, this moment marked both relief and sorrow. After all these years, they finally had the truth. The uncertainty that had plagued them for decades was over, but the pain of knowing how their loved one had died would never fully fade. Her memory was now preserved not just in their hearts, but in the conviction of the man who had taken her life. The significance of this case lies not only in the conviction of Robert Atrop's, but in the perseverance of those who refused to let Deborah's story remain a mystery. Cold case detectives, driven by their commitment to justice, never gave up on the case, even when it seemed there was no hope left. And the role of modern forensic science, specifically the advances in DNA testing, demonstrated just how far the field had come. What once seemed impossible, the resolution of a 37-year-old case, was now a reality. This case is a powerful reminder of the significance of persistence and innovation in solving cold cases. Forensic advancements like DNA testing have transformed the way the justice system approaches long unsolved crimes. Deborah Atrop's case was a testament to how technology, combined with the tireless work of dedicated detectives, can bring closure to families, no matter how long the journey takes.